Good evening. You got to go ahead and open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11. As we camp out in Matthew chapter 11 tonight, we're going to be talking about disappointment. And to illustrate disappointment, I'd like to tell you a quick story. When I was a kid during Halloween, my mom would call the neighbors next door before I would go trick-or-treat and tell them to give me Fig Newtons for cookies and raisins for candy. And so disappointment is expectation is here, and then you have reality. And when the reality does not match expectation, when reality crashes into our expectations, the result is disappointment. And so if I want to be extremely vulnerable and honest with all of you tonight, for 2018, there have been joys and there have been blessings, but there's also been a series of disappointments. There has been. And maybe you can connect with that tonight as well. I don't know what your story is. I don't know what kind of disappointments that have been in your life. I don't know what kind of expectations you've had. Maybe it was expectations about work, about your career, about school, about relationships. Maybe it was an expectation about your health. And then reality came crashing in, leaving you in a wreck of disappointment. And so often, disappointment is a breeding ground for confusion and for disillusionment and for pain, isn't it? And so tonight, the question I want us to answer in the short time we have is this: how do we survive disappointment? Like, how do we get through the disappointment? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at Matthew chapter 11, and we're going to look at this guy named John. And John, we're going to look at the disappointment that John faced. And then once we see the disappointment that John faced, we're going to lift up our eyes and look to Jesus and the promises that Jesus made. So let's go ahead and start here. I'm starting at verse 1, Matthew chapter 11. When Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in their cities. Jesus has been super busy since the beginning of his ministry. Like, he's been announcing the kingdom, he's been describing the kingdom, but this kingdom has been, the way he's describing the kingdom is completely turning their expectations upside down, isn't it? And he's not only been describing the kingdom, but he's been living out the kingdom. He's going among the people and he's healing, he's performing miracles. And then we get to Matthew chapter 11, and we begin to see the different responses to this Jesus. And some people look at this Jesus and they go, yes. And others people, they look at this Jesus and they go, no. And then other people look at this Jesus and they go, not sure. And what's so interesting is the very first response recorded in Matthew chapter 11 is from John. And his response is, I'm not sure. So let's read verse 2 and verse 3 and see what John is not sure about. Now when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? So first of all, who is this guy John? You may know him by his other name, John the Baptist. He was that guy who lived out in the wild, who was wearing like camel fur or whatever, and like when he wasn't teaching people, he was eating honey with his bare hands, like crunching on locusts and all that cool stuff, that guy. And what's interesting is his life's purpose was to prepare people for his cousin Jesus. In that culture, when the royalty would travel, there would be someone who would be sent ahead of the royalty to prepare the roads. That was John. God called John to prepare the roads into people's hearts before the coming king. So my question is this: why is John not sure then? Like, if anybody should be super sure about Jesus, it should be John. I mean, his life's work has been preparing people for the coming Messiah, and now he's going, wait a minute. Are you the Messiah? Now I want you to look here. For us to understand why John was not sure, we have to look at a sermon he preached back in chapter 3. And the best way to describe John's style of preaching is fire and brimstone. Actually, more fire than brimstone. Because he looks at the religious leaders of the day and he calls them, you snakes. And then he looks at the people and he says, okay, if you don't change, you're going to burn. And you're not just going to burn, you're going to burn with fire. Not just burn with fire, you're going to burn with unquenchable fire. Like, God already has the axe of the tree. I mean, that's the kind of preacher John was. And so that was just, so imagine, you're John. Here's John's expectation, what John thinks Jesus will do, what John has been saying Jesus will do. And then you have reality. what Jesus actually does. John has been saying Jesus is going to bring judgment to the people, and then he sees Jesus bringing healing to the people. John has been saying that Jesus is going to bring the axe to the sinners, and then he sees Jesus having feast with sinners. And to make it worse, in the very next chapter, in chapter 4, right after John baptizes Jesus, by the way, Jesus starts his ministry and John is thrown in prison. You want to talk about disappointment? And so John is left asking, are you the one? Are you? And some of you tonight, maybe you were asking that exact same question. Are you the one? God, I thought you were God who was good. God, I thought you were God who was loving. God, I thought you were God who cared. So what we want to do now is we want to lift up our eyes and look to what Jesus says. And there's two promises in the next three verses, 4, 5, and 6. There are two promises that we want to look at, and then we'll be done. Starting in verse 4. And Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. And the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them." What I love about this, and maybe you'll miss if you don't know the full context of what's going on, Jesus is quoting from a number of prophecies from the book of Isaiah that John would have known so well, like the back of his hand. He's been talking about this stuff. And as Jesus is as the messenger is quoting these verses back to John, John would have known them so well, he's already filling in the blanks. It'd be like if I was quoting to you Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created You're already filling in the blanks. And so John's already filling in the blanks. Jesus come to give the blind sight. He's come to cleanse the lepers, to give the deaf hearing, to preach to the poor, and what? There's one more part to that verse. What about the last one? Did Jesus say the last one? No. Well, that's all Jesus said. Yeah. But what about the last part of that verse? The opening of the prison to those who are bound. If you're John, you're thinking, you skipped one, Jesus. What about the opening of the prison to those who are bound? Because I'm in prison. And it's as if Jesus is looking at John saying, John, I am the Messiah and you are not, and you will stay in prison and die there. There are two promises, and the first one is this. The promise to John and to us is that disappointment is inevitable. Jesus promises disappointment. And I think it's so important for us to see from Scripture that following Jesus does not always mean you will be wealthy, you will always be healthy, and that everyone will always be loving you. Jesus never says that when you come up out of the waters and be rainbows and be spraying Jesus dust everywhere. He never says that. In fact, he says right before he goes to the cross, in John, he says, I have said these things to you that in me you may have peace. And you go, yes, I would love peace. What is it? And he says, in the world you will face tribulation. You will face hardship. You will face disappointment. But what I love is Jesus doesn't just leave us hanging. He doesn't just leave us hanging there. Yes, he promises disappointment, but yes, he's honest with us, but he also loves us. And he wants to give us hope. So the very next thing he says is this, but take heart. I have overcome the world. And so verse 4 and verse 5, yes, Jesus promises disappointment, but in verse 6, he's going to make another promise, and it's a promise of hope. Listen what he says. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me. Here's what he's saying. Blessed are those who can see past what they think I'm doing and see what I'm actually doing. Blessed are those who can see past their expectations and see the reality of what I'm doing. In other words, there's a point to this. John, I know you thought there was going to be an axe to the tree, but I need you to see past what you thought was going to happen and see what's actually happening. That somebody's going to take a very real axe, and they're going to cut down a very real tree, and they're going to hang me on that tree, and I'm going to conquer the ultimate evil. There's something bigger and better going on. The apostles, I know in your mind that no Messiah, that a dead Messiah is a no Messiah, That a tomb with the body of your king in it means no kingdom, like kingdom out, not happening. But I need you to see past what you thought was going to happen. I need you to see what's actually going on. Because in 3 days, that tomb will be empty. And that will win the ultimate victory. And tonight he comes to you and says, I know you had these expectations. I know there was these things you wanted to happen. But I need you to see past what you thought was going to happen. And see what I'm actually doing in your life. And it's bigger and it's better. And so tonight, maybe you find yourself, and let me give you my second point. First of all, he promises us that disappointment is inevitable, but he also promises us that disappointment has purpose. He promises disappointment, but he also promises us that when we're in him, there is purpose and there is hope and there's peace, even despite the disappointment. And so tonight, again, I don't know your story. Maybe tonight you find yourself in this prison of disappointment and you are asking God, are you the one? Are you the one? And I want you to know that God is saying, yes, I am the one who's acting for my glory and your joy. But so often the path to our joy and his glory goes right through the valley of the shadow of death, right through disappointment. And Jesus has come to you and he's saying, but take heart because I have overcome the world. And my victory can be your victory if you're in me. And so tonight I ask you, are you in him? In him, he takes the disappointments that we find so crushing and he uses it to draw us closer to himself so that we can find healing. In him, he takes the confusion and he turns it into hope. In him, he takes the disillusionment and he turns it into direction. In him, he takes the pain and he turns it into peace. And so tonight I ask you, are you in him? Why don't you come now as we stand and sing?